So you want to create realistic drawings which begin to look more like photographs depending on how good you are.
This style of art is often referred to as photorealism. There's also hyperrealism, although I wouldn't say that my drawings have ever been that realistic, nor have I ever strived for them to be like that.
I still want my drawings to look like drawings, but what I am drawing should look a lot like what I am drawing. And what I am drawing is typically a photograph of something.
Now, of course, art is subjective. Everyone has their own opinion.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Boxman, who is on a mission to learn perspective, prefers to create more technical drawings. Boxgirl likes, well, she's kind of in the process of figuring out what she likes, and that's fine. Whereas Mortimer, he doesn't seem to like anything.
Ah, realistic pencil drawings. How utterly quaint. While I can certainly appreciate the technical prowess required to replicate the world in such a way, one must question, is mere reproduction truly art? Art, you see, should challenge the viewer, provoke thought, and transcend the mundane. Realism, in its unyielding obsession with fidelity, can be a bit pedestrian.
Well, I guess that's it for this video then.
All jokes aside, realistic drawing is something that I've always been a fan of. Yes, in recent years it's become less of a focus for me as I've been teaching perspective drawing, but I still find a lot of enjoyment in sitting down and drawing from a photograph that's in front of me. The process is, well, really quite therapeutic, and the final result is satisfying.
Now I want to dedicate this video to realistic drawing and talk about some of the things that I've learnt over the years, as well as explaining some of the steps involved in creating a drawing this way.
Also, quick side note, I've come to realise that my work has a somewhat unique style to it. Whilst it still falls into that realism category, I tend to focus heavily on textures, meaning the pencil marks I place on the paper in an effort to create these textures are fairly pronounced in the final result. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad, depending on what I'm drawing. And although this is somewhat unintentional, I do like it because, as I said, I want my drawings to still look like drawings.
These pencil marks you mention, so conspicuously exposed, risks suffocating the image in an overwhelming, almost vulgar display.
Anyways, let's discuss some of the steps involved and what I consider when drawing this way.
The first thing I want to talk about is art supplies and what it is that you are attempting to draw with, because it does make a difference. Having supplies that are good quality does make life a little easier, but it's not as essential as you might assume.
You can have all the gear, but no idea.
Well, why don't you start by telling us what you use to draw?
Well, if you're familiar with my videos, then you're probably aware that most of the time I draw with just one pencil, this being a Uniball Karutoga mechanical pencil, with which I use some 2B Pentel lead. And there's multiple reasons why I only use this, which I've explained in the past, but a big one for me is convenience. I don't have to spend time sharpening my pencils or swapping them around. That's not to say that a set of standard pencils, each with a different grade, isn't useful, because I still use some of those softer grades when darkening and adding some contrast to a drawing. There's a lot of different brands of pencils out there. A few I've used in the past are from Faber-Castell, Derwent, Staedtler. All of them are great in getting the job done, but as a general rule, the more you pay, the more you get. That's not always the case, but for the most part, it's worth investing in a good set of pencils if you're serious about drawing. In my opinion, what's also worth paying a bit of money for is some high quality paper. If you're creating a drawing which requires a lot of time and effort, you don't want to be drawing on printer paper. Instead, you want to be drawing on something with a higher GSM, which is the weight of the paper, or thickness. Cartridge paper can be a good choice, but make sure the paper isn't textured, because that same texture will come through in the drawing. And unless you actually like that look, you'll be better off getting some paper with a smoother surface. The best option, in my opinion, is to use some smooth Bristol board. And this is expensive, but it's closer to card than it is paper, and it's perfect for drawing on. At least when it comes to creating a highly detailed drawing, which will take a lot of time.
So, I have my pencils and paper. What else do I need?
Well, now you have what you need to start drawing, but no offense, you're probably going to make some mistakes. That's why you need an eraser. Now there's a few options, but I mostly use this, which is a Tombow Mono Zero eraser. I think that's how you pronounce it, and it's a tool I often recommend to artists because it's very useful, especially when creating realistic pencil drawings. It allows you to be very accurate when erasing pencil marks, and it's also good for creating highlights in a drawing.
Now those are the three main things that you'll need to create a realistic drawing, but of course there are other things which might be nice to have, but they aren't essential. Things like a ruler, a sharpener, blending sticks, you know, I've used those in the past. There's a lot of stuff that's nice to have, but I'm not going to go into too much detail because, you know, we've got other things to discuss.
So I'm going to assume that you are drawing from a photograph. Now this could be a photograph of a family member, a nice landscape, a picture of a new car, or it might be a well-known celebrity / character from a TV show. It can be anything. And the good news is that no matter what you are drawing, all of what I'm discussing here is relevant. For example, proportions. If you are drawing a picture of your gran, then you want to make sure that your drawing actually looks like her. And this is easier said than done. Even the smallest error can make or break a portrait. If the facial features aren't positioned correctly and at the right size, then Grandma could end up looking like Sloth from the Goonies.
Sometimes people call me Chunk.
Whilst this isn't as crucial when drawing other things like landscapes and cars, it's still good practice to try and be as accurate as possible. I've drawn a fair few portraits in my time, and whenever I've made a tutorial explaining how to do this, I've always suggested using a grid. Now, this grid is one which is placed onto the photograph you are using as reference, and then also recreated on the paper you are drawing on. Your reference image can exist on a screen in front of you, or you can choose to print it out. If you can do both of these things, then that's even better. Having the reference image up on screen is useful because you are able to zoom in and see all of those details. You can also create a grid digitally and then print that out, which I've explained how to do in a previous video. But my preferred approach, and one which is easier for beginners, is to print out the photograph at the same size you are drawing it at and then create a grid by hand. Again, I have videos on the channel specifically on how to create these grids, and the same grid is drawn on top of the reference image and also on the paper you are drawing on.
Once you have this grid drawn out, you can progress onto the next stage, which is where you will start to outline the drawing. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is, I'd say, the most important part of the process.
You need your outline to be as accurate as possible. That's why we went to the effort of creating a grid, because the grid can help guide you when it comes to judging where and what you need to draw and at what size to draw everything at. Now, if you are creating a portrait of a person, then I typically like to start with their eyes, because this often seems to be the hardest yet most essential part to get right. In other words, get the hardest part out of the way first, and then you can relax a bit. Maybe relax is the wrong word to use because all of this stage requires you to focus. Pay attention to the grid lines and observe the points at which they cross areas of the reference image behind. I'll often stop and move over to another unit of the grid and start drawing in a different area. This avoids the risk of getting too carried away, drawing in one area and eventually in the wrong area. But the grid lines should help you avoid doing that. It goes without saying that when outlining a drawing, you don't want to place too much pressure down on the pencil. These outlines are only there to map out the drawing and get a sense of where things are. They're not permanent, and the same goes for the grid lines. You want to keep your lines light so that you can erase them later or either draw over them.
Even with a grid, this is pretty hard. Can't I just trace the image?
I guess you could do that, but don't let Mortimer hear you say that word.
Tracing an image is always an option. You know, I'm not of the mind that tracing should be forbidden because it's your choice at the end of the day. And it comes down to what you want, right? If you want to just skip this step and choose to trace your image, then fine, but you're also skipping the step and the practice that plays a part in improving your drawing skills. But again, if your priority is to make sure that your drawing of grandma looks like grandma, then perhaps tracing your outlines makes some sense.
So now you have an outline of what it is you are drawing, and now we enter the rendering phase. This is the stage of a drawing which requires the most time, and I do want to mention here that creating a good realistic drawing demands that time. A lot of people have this misconception that creating a drawing shouldn't take that long, but when approaching a drawing this way, you need to understand that it's going to be a long and sometimes tedious process. The more time and effort you put into something, the better your results. Now, to explain this step, I'm going to refer to a few realistic drawings that I've created in past videos. In fact, a few weeks back, I uploaded a video titled Mastering the Pencil, 2 Methods for Control, and in that video I discussed 2 ways in which I control a pencil in order to produce various textures. This is 1, the way you move the pencil, and 2, the amount of pressure you apply with the pencil. It's definitely worth watching that video in addition to this one, as I go into a fair bit of detail explaining my thoughts behind this and how adjusting those 2 things creates different results. Now, because I've been drawing for a while and I have plenty of experience creating all kinds of realistic drawings like this, I'll often jump right into rendering in detail. Again, I like to start with the eyes if I'm drawing a portrait, and if I can get that right, then it's somewhat smooth sailing from there. In one of my older videos on the channel, I explain all of the steps involved in creating this portrait of Will Smith. Now, a lot has changed since then. A lot of people aren't a fan of Will Smith anymore, and my process has probably changed a little as well. For example, in this video, I had created my outlines and then I began detailing those facial features, the eyes, nose, mouth, even the eyebrows. And at that stage, I was left with creating a skin texture, for which I had used blending sticks. I forgot about that, but I had used them to smooth out my shading and create a base layer, which dealt with that gradation between the lighter areas and then the areas to the side of the face that were under a lot of shadow. When creating these darker shades, I'll often use some of the softer pencils and begin to apply more pressure. The reason I'm showing you this is because, as I said, my process has changed slightly. For example, in a more recent tutorial in which I was drawing Walter White from Breaking Bad, I had created my outline and then I went straight into rendering, creating textures and details. There was no preliminary shading stage like there was when I had drawn Will Smith, and I don't really have a good reason for this. I think it was due to the fact that the photograph of Will Smith involved a lot more shadow and flat shades. You know, there wasn't as much detail and texture to consider in comparison to the photograph of Walter White. So it really depends on whether the image you are drawing asks for it. I had progressed quite far with the drawing of Will Smith before I had even began creating a skin texture, but it's not often I'll create a base layer like that. Like I say, I'll often jump right into creating textures through drawing what I see.
Now, this is something else that I want to discuss, and again, I explain a lot of the methods behind creating different textures in other videos, so I don't want to do that here, but I do want to talk about the act of recreating a photograph and how I use the reference image.
To put it simply, I attempt to draw what I see, and I mean this in the most literal sense, right? I am looking at each pore in the skin when observing the reference image, and then I attempt to replicate that on my paper. This, of course, is just a small mark with the pencil, but in terms of a skin texture, that's all I'm doing when creating that. I'm putting down all of these small marks, which are influenced by the marks I see when observing the reference image, and I try my best to get these exactly the same as they are shown. Now, of course, this takes a long time and it's never going to be exact, right? But in making the effort to be exact, you achieve a result which is close enough, and also one that is good enough. This approach, as I mentioned earlier in the video, can result in my drawings being too textured. And whilst this can sometimes be an issue, it really depends on what I'm drawing. If I'm drawing a portrait of a young child, for instance, then the texture of their skin will be a lot smoother. So I'd take a different approach, one that involves less texturing and more shading. Whereas an image of an old person, like grandma, You know, this is a video from Patreon, by the way. This is not actually my grandma, it's just an old woman, but you can see how textured and detailed I make this drawing. When looking at the photograph, you can see all of the wrinkles and pores in her skin, all of which informs the pencil marks that I put down on paper. Whilst I've been talking a lot about realistic drawing in relation to creating portraits of people, all of this applies to drawing other things as well, like a landscape for example. Here as I draw out this image of an old wooden barn, I'm taking the same approach when drawing the trees as I do when creating a skin texture. It's a collection of marks that I see within the image I am drawing from.
I do want to say that I'm not saying that this is the way you should approach your own drawings. I'm simply explaining my own process. I'm aware that the results aren't as realistic as the work by other artists, but again, I'm not trying to be like that. I enjoy drawing this way. And yeah, that's it, really.
Now when I approach a drawing this way, I eventually get to the point where most of the drawing has received this treatment and to some extent is complete. However, as a result of focusing so much on creating these textures and details, I have paid less attention to values, to light and shadow, and so there is a lack of contrast. And so to rectify that, it's now a case of darkening and developing the drawing further. I'll often use a much softer pencil at this stage, and as I look at the reference image, I'm looking at it as a whole now. I'm not so concerned with those smaller details. Instead, I'm looking at the shadows that are present or the lighter areas that I might need to highlight. And I'm constantly comparing my drawing with the image, trying to pinpoint areas that need some extra work. Again, I'm focusing on the overall drawing as a whole instead of being bothered by the details. At this stage, I also make some final adjustments and I'm comparing my drawing with the reference image and hopefully I'm happy with it. Sometimes, of course, I'm not happy with it, and so the drawing goes in the bin. I'm joking, I don't throw my drawings in the bin, only Boxman's.
So that's a video on the subject of realistic drawing. It was more so a discussion surrounding my process and some considerations, but hopefully you can extract some nuggets from this. I don't know what I'm saying. Anyways, thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.